Hello and welcome to The Price of Time, the show where we explore the defining moments that made people who they are today and the impact of those moments over time. Here's your host, Luke Tatum. Hello and welcome to The Price of Time. My name is Luke Tatum. I'm the host for today, and we are going to be talking today to Ben Stimpson, our wonderful guest for today. We're going to get into the moment that shaped his life, as we always do here on the show. Ben Stimpson is a BA, MBA, CP, and he's an integrative therapist, spiritual director, author, podcaster, and independent scholar of folklore and history. Ben holds a BA in medieval, classical, and religious studies from the University of Waterloo. He holds a postgraduate diploma in spiritual psychotherapy, and he is the author of Ancestral Whispers, a guide to developing ancestral veneration practices, which is something I know nothing about, and I'm excited to learn about here on the show today. So, Ben, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you. I'm looking forward to this. Thank you for having me on, Luke.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's my pleasure. So, if you would, let's just start with kind of what is the moment, the one thing that we're going to be focused on here today. You know, what's obviously, you are who you are now, and you were someone different in the past, right? There are things, there are key moments in life that shape you, and so that's what we're going to key in on. So what's the key moment we're going to talk about today?
The key moment of mine was a particular moment in September of 2015 when I suddenly became aware that a big decision needed to be made in my life. And I was completely unaware of it before an opportunity presented itself in that moment. And I got a body sensation that something was big, something was working behind the scenes, something like clockwork was happening. And I needed to either get out of the way and let it happen or go with that flow. And so I had to be very, very conscious and aware in that moment. And as it turned out, the decision I made was perfectly right. And here I am now with all those beautiful titles that I have.
Okay, so all of that happened after this moment then?
Yes, very much.
Wow,
so, yes.
wow, okay. So definitely a big decision, or a big moment,
Mm-hmm.
I should say. And so how long ago was this? How far from the moment in question are we?
Well, so it happened in September 2015, so we're looking at 8.5 years. So 8.5 years of perpetually moving forward. All of the decisions I've made were really based on that main moment. I would be very different. And I don't think I would have accomplished all the things I've accomplished now if it hadn't been that kind of ball starting to roll down the hill.
Well, so and the hope with the show, of course, is that others can learn from the key decisions that people have made, right? And so we want to get into all that. But first, before we really, really dive in, what was your life like? I mean, what were we changing from into, the Ben Stimpson of today?
Totally. So I came from the United Kingdom when I was 8 years old. I came to Canada, where I grew up in a tiny little town, middle of nowhere, really like everybody was related to each other and I wasn't related to anybody. I tried to escape to go to the city, and I did. I ended up going and studying social work when I was in my late teens down in Toronto. And I never really fit with that. There wasn't a moment in my life where I really knew what I wanted to be. No, I say that I did know what I wanted to be, but I was persuaded by people in my life, whether it be school counselors, my parents, or people, but that wouldn't be a viable thing for me. And so I chose what was on a list, which was social work, because I was very people-oriented, and I was a good listener, things like that, right? Blah, blah, blah. So I go down to Toronto, and I study social service work at the diploma level and then go to university. And it was just too much for me. I knew I didn't want to do that. And I got to a point where I was just dreading graduating because then I would have to go into that field after 4 years of studying this. So I dropped out. I had a mental health issue. I dropped out. And I went and lived with my parents for 5 years, worked for them. They had a small business. My parents have been entrepreneurs forever. My family, kind of where the ancestral piece comes in, my family story has been entrepreneurs going back like 5-6 generations on both sides.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah,
it's huge. And we can talk about kind of the spiritual stuff around that later on. But suffice it to say, I was just kind of going through the motions of life. I was a college dropout, living with my parents, working for my parents, and of course, being in a workaholic family, I wasn't being paid much. I was really just being paid minimum wage because I had the right name, right?
What's minimum wage up there? What was it?
So minimum wage up here back then was $14. So I think that translates to the US to be about $10 back then, USD.
Yeah, so not dissimilar. It's pretty close.
Very on par, right? I think Canada has had higher at times. I think we're faster in implementing it than the States, or many places of the States, but very, very similar. And being with the right name and being part of the family, it was very much you don't deserve to be paid more. So I just kind of lingered. And for 5 years, I basically just floundered. I didn't really know what to do with myself. I didn't have direction. And in 2014, I started a small vending business. I was like, you know what? Let's see if I can do this. So I had a lot of savings then. I made the mistake of buying in a load of stock. I should have gotten onto a drop shipping kind of bandwagon back then, but I didn't. And I just started going to festivals and fairs and things like that. And in 2015, I started doing, because I was selling crystals and Buddhist stuff and like little statues and holistic stuff, right? And so I started going to a psychic fair and just vending at psychic fairs and like hippie festivals and new age festivals, things like that. And it wasn't really giving me the income that I was looking for, but it was also, more crucially, getting me out of the house, because we also happened to live and work in the same building. Like literally workaholism there. Everything's in one building. I wasn't really going anywhere.
Guilty, workaholic. My wife and I joke all the time that we're both workaholics, and I'm also a college dropout. So similar. I mean, I don't want to say a similar story because I haven't heard your story yet, but the foundations here are eerily familiar.
It's one of when you speak to a lot of people, I feel like a lot of people have gone through that and trying to find out what they were wanting. I mean, 18 years old, I think, is too young to really know what somebody wants to do with their life, especially the way the system is set up. And I mean, the huge amount of money that people are paying in North America. Canada's a little better than the States, of course, but it's still a huge amount of money. And then after 4 years or 6 years, you have people who don't know what to do with themselves. They've just gone through a whole degree program, and they don't know what to do with it. And that was me. But in my case, I had all of this education, but I had nothing to show for it. And so I had no way of gaining employment outside of that. And so in 2015, I was starting to get out, starting to reconnect with people, starting to, make connections. And the community I was living in, there was about 8,000 people, middle of nowhere, right? So very, very different from living in the city. Very different from the opportunities were not there. And I was depressed. I was depressed the whole time because I wasn't moving forward. I wasn't being who I should have been, right?
So that leads us to 2015, which is when this big thing is. So, and I say big thing. That's kind of non-specific language, but the transformative moment, the thing you alluded to before, right? And so this bodily sensation of things have to change, basically. So walk us through that. I mean, if you could drill in a little closer to exactly what that was like and what led to all these other things.
So the summer of 2015, I was really starting to get out there. That was the first summer of my business. Previously, I had been vending at a small flea market and really wasn't generating maybe $200 a month. Really, it was a hobby more than anything else. But with these festivals, it was traveling around, going to places I'd never been to before and connecting with people I wouldn't have normally connected with. And so in September, I was at the psychic fair and I mean, typical vision of what a psychic fair is, a lot of people like floating about and doing their thing and being who they were and whatnot. And the woman whose table was next to mine was selling, she was a local psychotherapist. And she also had a large room filled with books that she operated a small business out. And so she was running the book table. And so we started talking and chatting. And as it turned out, she was her little place in the city that was about an hour and a half south of where I was living was a satellite campus of a place in Toronto that has been running for like 30 years. And I actually knew about this place when I was going through social work years before. And I thought maybe that would be a good program for me to take later on. But it was out of scope. By that time, I wasn't even thinking of becoming a therapist. But she introduced herself. We started chatting. She said, well, I've got these classes coming up and starting in a couple of weeks' time. And they feel like they will be a good fit for you. And they were self-development classes, they were assertiveness training, they were all sorts of things. They were exploring yourself, right? They were personal development classes. And at that moment, as I was driving home, the hour and a half going home, I started getting this weird feeling. And it was that uncanny feeling that you get when a coincidence has happened. And I don't mean just a coincidence, like, oh, somebody, happened to be passing by and, you meet up with them. Like the type of coincidence that you see sometimes spoken about online, where it's like, a husband and a wife are going through photos, and it turns, and the husband of a wife sees themselves in their partner's photo from like 30 years before, at a place that they would never have met. They didn't know each other, right? And it's just this bizarre kind of thing where they were in the same place at the same time, but didn't connect. That sliding door sort of situation, right?
Mm-hmm. Like a synchronicity type of a thing?
Synchronicity, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And synchronicity, as it turns out, synchronicity is a big part of what this training program I eventually went on talks about.
Cool. Very cool.
Very Jungian in approach, transpersonal. And how I experienced it was this like uncanny dawning feeling that something was happening. There was some connection here. There was something, I was in the flow. There was some kind of a flow going on. And I could either fight against it or I could go with it. And so I decided, like back then, the commitment, I had a smart car too, so it was a little easier with gas to go back and forth. But it was going to be a huge time commitment. It was on Tuesday nights, 6 o'clock. So I would have to leave home 4:30 and drive down and then drive up again. So 3 hours of driving for a 2-hour class. Like, what was I thinking, right? But I had this feeling, this is something I should really do. This is something I need to do. And as it turned out, as I decided to do them, started to drive and take this 8-week course, and then I was hooked. And she had a series of 8 or 9 classes, and they were all curriculum from this school in Toronto. But eventually, after 2 years, I decided, I'm going to apply and try and salvage the social work education that I had. And go and train as a psychotherapist, which I ended up doing. And that was a huge commitment because it was in Toronto. Of course, I was living up in a little place called Hanover at the time. So 3 hours away as opposed to just an hour and a half. And I decided to do that. And it was one of the only routes I could go forward with the amount of education I had, but not having a BA at that time. So I didn't have my BA. And they accepted me because of I was able to prove all these courses that I had. I had my transcript, and they took me on. A year later, they had to change that, so they couldn't accept people in that route. So it was one of those, I just got in there just right. And so throughout the kind of following years, I seem to always find myself in that position of I just got there at the right time.
That's so interesting because, again, my wife and I have this conversation all the time. We were having this, I'm forgetting right now what it was about. We just were talking about this morning, how it's like so weird that we have like perfect timing on things. It's like I started in the finance industry right when, that's what we were talking about. We were talking about the finance industry. And so for most of time, finance has been like paper applications. Like you think about where banking is, modern banking, the insurance world and financial world is 10, 20, 25 years behind in terms of technology. And so we were talking about how like right when I got into finance is when everything started to be more digital focused. Now we can do electronic signatures and I have clients in half of the states basically here in the US. And that wouldn't be possible, without me going on an airplane every single day to go all over the place. Not that long ago. And so it's just like, it's a very interesting kind of doing the right thing at the right time. And, at least as far as I believe, you kind of feel that. So talking about your physiological sensation, like if you're doing the right thing at the right time and you kind of are, are doing what you're meant to do, then that's like a sensation. It's not just, oh, wow, how would I know? It's like, no, you'll know. So,
This is the thing. It's very much that, right? And this is where, for me, it's a faith-based thing, whatever your faith, regardless of how you conceptualize your faith, right? But I do know a lot of people will say it's like that when that angel appears, when you're like stuck on the highway and suddenly an angel appears, like random guy with the truck that just has the right equipment for you to get out of the ditch or whatever, right? And I've had that experience myself, right? It's that divine timing kind of thing, right? And for me, it was like there were so many things that took place in the years just after that moment. 2016, because of the amount of development I still needed to do, I had a series of people come back into my life, 7 of them all in total, through bizarre circumstances. And every single one of them contributed to this development of me, either for me to heal myself or for me to let go of things or for them to let go of things. And when I say it's bizarre, like the last one, the final one of that year, came back into my life because of me deciding to do this program of self-development classes and also then going on and studying at the main school in Toronto. I'd moved to another city to be closer to that campus in 2018. I reconnected with this person at the end of 2016, just online, and there was a lot of anger between us still. There was a lot of interpersonal stuff. He was my best friend at one point, and there was a lot of connection still there. And when I moved to the other city to be closer to Toronto, it turns out, because it took us several years to actually get, to a point where we would meet up and we would actually talk about things. It turns out that the office I was renting for my practicum was literally next door to his therapist's office on the same row. Right? It turns out that his office, because he's also a therapist, was like 5-minute walk around from where I was living, and I had no idea. Like it was bound to happen. We were going to run into each other. And how can you explain that sort of thing?
Right. I know that there's a lot of people out there that ascribe no importance to things like that, right? It's a statistical near impossibility, but these things happen. And, my counter to that is like, okay, but do we really know that everything is just a statistical calculation? I mean, is that a given assumption? Because I don't really feel that it is, and that doesn't mean that I have a thorough, rigid explanation that I'm going to slot in to replace statistics, but I'm just trying to say, hey, I maybe don't have a full comprehension of the whole universe. And correlation doesn't equal causation, those kind of things. It's like, okay, so where is the causation? Do we even understand how that works? And
well, and I think that, on one level, yes, but on the other level of how can you explain hunches and how can you explain gut instinct, right? Gut instinct, I am a strong believer in, and I work a lot with my clients around. And people in business talk about this all the time. They had a hunch that something was about to happen or that they needed to do something, right?
And time again, Ben, that happens to me in business and, in our family, our household, when we're doing things, it's like, oh man, I'm really glad we decided to do that at that particular time because of X, Y, Z. But we didn't know. It's not that we looked out and saw data and then ran a calculation. It's a gut thing, or a heart thing, or whatever.
It is a gut thing. It's a gut thing, and it's also that I'm a strong believer in being placed where we need to be, that whole divine timing thing. We might not, and I work a lot with the clients around this, we might not necessarily on a rational level like where we happen to be. but I do strongly believe that things happen for a reason. I'll give the pandemic as a good example. And I'm not here to say that the pandemic was put together because I needed it to happen in this way, but I think a lot of people benefited from what happened afterwards.
Sure.
So I did my training in psychotherapy. It was a 2-year part-time program, started in September 2017. So like literally 2 years after I had met this woman, and I was starting to do these courses. And I graduated ended in September 2019. Started working with clients. I had a small gaggle of clients at that point. And then the pandemic happened and we all went online. I lost all my clients and I had to rebuild from nothing. Now I'm in a position about a year later where all of my clients are online, all over the United States, all over Canada, a couple in other countries, and I was able to quit my part-time job that I was working in a little bookstore at the time, and I quit that job because I was able to go, full-time psychotherapy, which is huge, right? I'm now in a position. Well, I'm now in a position where I'm actively building. I've closed down my Canadian clientele. I'm focusing on building clientele in the UK, so that later in the year when I move over there, I'm in the process of moving back to the UK. I will have a full client load. I'll have everything set up. I have everything set up. So while I have a job in the UK, so I'm not going off and just having to find a job and floundering. And I would never have been able to do that if the pandemic hadn't forced us.
I read a news story just a day or so ago of someone who moved to a new state. They went to their new job, so they were expecting relocation assistance, that sort of thing. They moved to a new state. They start working at this new job, and a few days into their job, they're told, "Hey, we didn't actually hire you." And so,
what?
Right. And so, just imagine. I mean, that's obviously a worst case, right? That's a crazy outlier situation, but the hoops that people jump through for, a job are crazy. And I mean, I love entrepreneurship and I love the fact that I'm always working, but I'm also kind of always on vacation because I get to have fun, And so the balance is ultimately up to me. And if I have a lot to do, I can work harder and I don't have to ask permission. And if I need to work less because something crazy is going on, I don't have to ask permission, right? It's a double-edged sword. My income reflects, my input, of course, but it's a very empowering thing. And so to your point, like you can move to a new country or return to a country where you came from and have it ready made. You can do all the prep work you want before you go, and it's on your timetable, and you can set the expectations with your clients. And, what you do is very relationship focused, similar to what I do, right? So that's wonderful. And yeah, a lot of people would really like to have an opportunity like that where they can say, okay, I'm going to move and I want it to be a minimal impact to my bottom line. But that's not how regular employment typically works, right? So
I mean, that's the thing. Self-employment, my experience with self-employment, especially growing up in a self-employment situation, my parents were self-employed. I can see how much hard work, and you know this too. I'm sure many of your self-employed listeners also know how this works. It's not a 9-to-5 job. It's a, 7:30 in the morning to 10 o'clock at night with breaks of 4 or 5 hours here or there, right? It's constantly knowing that you have a form to fill out, or this to apply for, or this bank statement to go through, taxes to have to prepare, all of these things. But at the end of the day, it's on your time scale, right? And I found this was particularly helpful for all of the things I've been doing in the past couple of years. So in 2000, so the little city I was living in, college town, about 2 hours outside of Toronto, has 2 universities and a college. So colleges up here are like community colleges down there as opposed to universities. So huge student population, a lot of opportunity. And we were just coming out of the pandemic, 2021, and I decided, I really want my BA. I want to finish it. I want to see what I can do. So and it was, again, those divine timing pieces, right? I had that sensation that has been familiar all these years. Now is the time. I need to do this now. So I contacted the local university in November, thinking that I would have to apply in January for an entrance in September. I contacted them. They said, no. If you want to apply for a part-time position, we can get you in for January. And then after that first semester, go to full-time. And that's what I did. So I started with 2 classes. They gave me 50/50 transfer credits. So I would only have to do 2 years, but 2 years worth of credits. And within 2 years, I was finished my BA, and it was entirely focused on what I wanted to do, which was the history, the folklore, the humanities piece. And that has opened me up into my authorship. So most of my writing is connected to that history piece, to that spirituality piece. Folklore is a big thing. So I have these 2 streams of my life now. And I feel like we live in a world where we have to portfolio our life. A lot of self-employed people have to have multiple pies. And that suits me fine, because the amount of money that I'm gaining from my therapy practice was enough to pay outright my remaining studies, and I paid as I go. So I just finished, and I'm about to graduate in June, but I just finished in December, and I don't have any debt for it because I was paying.
That's wonderful. Yeah. From the financial standpoint, of course I can sit here and talk about it all day, but
totally is. I admit, like, Canada's cheaper than the United States. It only cost me, I think, altogether $17,000 for the 2 years. But I was living by myself. I was also working, and I was, but it was great. I would not have been able to do that with the time scale. Even I would not have been able to be doing that with a full-time job outside and self-employed.
Yeah. So let's talk about folklore and in your book and some of these things, because we haven't really talked about it at all except for the very beginning. Yeah. And I do want to get into all that, and then we'll maybe rewind and talk about if none of this had happened, where things might go. But I've got, you might be able to see, I don't know, Joseph Campbell back here, and some things. So yeah, I'm not an expert by any stretch, but I do like those things. There's a wonderful book by Robert Bly called Iron John.
Iron John, exactly. It's a mythopoetic movement. Yes.
I don't know. It's a wonderful book, right? It was gifted to me many years ago, and with the instruction that I pass it on to someone else. So I actually don't have a copy
wonderful
anymore. Yeah. But, those kinds of things interest me. Carl Jung is very interesting to me. I've read several of his books. And so, I sense that we have a lot of things we could get into and probably turn this into a 6-hour podcast, which I would do to you. But for the purposes of today, how did all of these things come together and kind of create your book? What is your book about? If you'll just kind of walk me through that.
Absolutely. So it's part and parcel with it. The self-development program that I needed to do was for my own benefit. It was really therapy. I needed therapy at that point. 4, 5 years, 6 years of sitting in this narrative that I was a failure, needed to be healed. And there was a lot of stuff from when I was a child, right? Coming over from the UK, I experienced massive culture shock because I was disconnected from everything that I knew. And that ancestral piece ties into that. The ancestors, my family stories, and those relationships ended because I wasn't anywhere close to the cemeteries where my ancestors are buried. The whole extended family I was disconnected from. And that caused a lot of issues for me. So when I was going through the psychotherapy training, a large part of what we needed to do was something called a genogram, which is a very specialized, of course, it's very jargony, but it's basically a tool used by social workers, by doctors, sometimes by chaplains, by people in the helping professions. And what it is it's a family history, not just through birth connections, but it's tracking relationships and patterns and kind of biomedical data, addictions, personality stuff through the generations. And there's so many different lenses that you can do, but it's looking at the stories and kind of the family culture that gets perpetuated down the family line. So one of the interesting things I found when I was looking at this family history was there was a crucial moment for both, tying in this whole podcast, there was a crucial moment for both my family lines. In the 1800s, there was this system in the UK called the workhouse It was a debtor's prison. So if you were, I think you've heard of this, if you had nothing, if you were bankrupt, if there was nothing, you could go and enroll in the workhouse. And in many ways, it was like a poor prison. It was a poor man's prison. Families would be separated. You'd be treated like dirt, and you would work your way out of the workhouse. And both my great-great-great-grandfathers on both my parents' sides ended up in the workhouse. And that's when the story in that family, both of those families, of you need to be a self-made person, you need to never be in this situation again, went down the family line. So you can follow, just in the professions, a lot of tradespeople, self-employed tradespeople, plumbers. Both my grandfathers were plumbers. Both my great-grandfathers were involved with the black market trade during World War One, right? Going to the American ships in Liverpool Dock and trading for, luxury American items to then sell to the local community. Before that, then there were cobblers. So a lot of self-employed people. And I think that's in why my parents ended up gravitating towards each other, because they recognized that they both came from the same sort of stock, and that came into me. So
it's very interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ben, but
please.
It's so interesting because I think there's this stereotype. I know there's this stereotype of ivory tower intellectuals. You're a scholar in some sense, right? And so that you would disdain the working man, and kind of have this you would never want to work in the trades. You would never want to be a plumber. And I mean, also even embracing your genealogy, your history, and some of these things, knowing about it at all, because I think there's a lot of, again, assumption stereotypes that would just say, well, why would you care? You're going to go kind of do your own thing and just burn the past to the ground for the sake of whatever new innovative thing that, you want to get into. And so, you're not doing that, so I just think that's very, very cool. I wanted to make that comment.
It's one of those things, socially speaking. I mean, especially in Western North America, the idea of being an individual is so much more important than collectivism. When you look around the world, collectivism is the norm, and really the Western world is the outlier of that. But I think that family piece is really important, and I feel like a lot of North Americans, at least, either only have their past few generations, or if they're more recent immigrants, their grandparents or even great-grandparents came from the old country, they have that disconnection, right? So I feel like that definitely ties into it. For me, I had that experience. I had no idea about this history. And that was the reason for this program to put this as the big project, to find out what has shown up in us. Because what happens is, when none of us are disconnected from our family culture, we grow up in a certain culture context within our family. We're raised a certain way because of how our parents were raised, who then raised them and who raised them, and so on and so on. And so that family ancestral piece has come down through generations. And at that point, it was really important for that spiritual connection to family too. I think a lot of people have become interested in that because movies like the movie Coco, or the Day of the Dead, right? Celebrating the family, going into the cemeteries, or inviting the family home and celebrating family, right? But not just family as it relates to us as individuals, who we are because of our families, and then who are we going to become and impact our generations going forward, right? So that was a big piece. And I'm sorry, I think I'm losing track of a question here, so I hope I'm answering
We're going to get to the book. We're going to talk
about
so
the book. Yeah. So when I graduated in 2019, I was like, okay, I need to figure out what is going to be my portfolio. What am I going to offer? Because nowadays, a lot of therapists offer classes and courses. You just have to, right? And so I started to put together a family history, kind of family culture course for clients. I wanted to condense it and create an experience. So I started writing it, and then the pandemic happened. And of course, we were all forced online. So I was like, okay, this is cool. I can deal with this because it's going to be a lot less expensive than renting a hall and, getting people physically close. So I ran the first version of it in 2020. in September, met with some really cool people, and we just explored these family pieces. But we explored these family pieces from a working with the ancestors as a spiritual approach. So very similar to the way the Mexican Day of the Dead or the Catholic Day of the Dead goes, inviting the family into the space or going and visiting the family as still not living beings, but as still being in existence somewhere. I think the Western Protestant rationalism that we exist in now says that the dead are dead and they're out and somewhere not connected to us. But when we really think about it, we still work with the dead. We tell their stories. We exist in the same spaces they existed in, just temporarily disconnected, right? And so when you look at most of the world's religions, most of the world's spiritual traditions, the dead are very much still being. They're just not living, right? And in many ways, that idea of the guidance, right? How many of us have experienced that presence of some kind of spiritual being? And for many people, it's those ancestors. And I feel like throughout this process of working with the ancestors in a spiritual sense, it really, and they really tied me into don't live in the past, because I was living in the past for so long. You don't belong there, really. So this forward motion, and I have so many spooky examples of this too, like synchronicities. I went to something called a dumb supper, which is a tradition you often see around Halloween. It's going and meditating with the dead. It's like kind of like a cafe structure or a dinner structure. There's places set that are empty for the dead. You go and commune with them, or you sit and just remember them. You offer them food. It's a very visceral experience. And so I was invited to one of those ones. And at the time I was working at a bakery. This is when I was doing my psychotherapy training. And I went in and I was like, okay, well, I need to bring something because it's potluck. So I grabbed a load of butter tarts, which I don't, do you get butter tarts down in?
Don't know what that is.
No. So imagine like it's a tart filled with like really viscous caramel and raisins. It's delicious.
Okay.
It's very, very nice.
I would love that.
They're very good. I'm sure you can find them somewhere down there, maybe at Walmart or somewhere, Walgreens. Or,
we happen to be in Walmart country. I don't want to derail the conversation.
Of course.
Walmart is based in Arkansas, and that's where we live. And so
totally.
There's Walmarts everywhere.
Everywhere. Yes, everywhere. Yes. Like Dollar Trees exist everywhere in Kentucky. No, totally.
They're even more, Dollar Trees are all over the place here. They're building new ones, You can't go anywhere without seeing Dollar Tree. But yes, Walmart is anyway,
it's everywhere. Yes, it's everywhere. Yeah. Well, so get back to the story then. I took these butter tarts to this, and I gave them to a woman who's organized this dumb supper, this silent cafe, and she bursts out crying. And I said, well, I know they're like 50% off, but they're still good, She said, no, you don't get it. I was really hoping that my dad would come through at the last one that I did a few hours before. She was doing 2 that day. And I was really hoping that he would, and he didn't. But this is a sign for me, because butter tarts were his favorite dessert. Like, right. So it's neat. I wouldn't have known that. No idea.
Sure. You had no way to know.
No way to know. But that's that part of that synchronicity piece, tying into what you were saying about, like Aaron John, for example, right? The story of you meet people in your life, or you meet beings in your life, and they become teachers for you. And in many ways, the ancestors have become teachers for me, because I've learned so much about myself through working with them, through working with their story. And so I wrote my first book around that process from a spiritual perspective. But I think that we do that anyways. We fill our homes with images of the dead. We fill our homes with the objects that used to belong to the dead. And we exist in the context that the dead created, in the same way that we're creating that context now for the future. So the type of world that we want to live in, and what we want our children to live in, right?
Yeah, you can't see it in the frame right now. I don't think it's on top of this shelf, sitting just on the very, very top shelf. But my grandfather on my mom's side has a kind of a history with the founding of Texas. So my grandfather is a member of the Sons of the Republic of Texas. Texas used to be a republic, and then it joined the states later. And so Sam Houston, for whom this major city Houston is named, he moved to Texas with my grandfather's great 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 grandfather. Right? They were childhood friends, and they moved together to Texas. And he died in a battle, and there's a marker for him and all that. His name is Crane, John Crane. And it's all just very interesting stuff. And that he wrote a story that's in this book that's sitting on the shelf back here, about John Crane. And it's written kind of from his perspective. Like, I was this, it's written as though John Crane wrote the story. He didn't. My grandfather wrote it. But, it's a very cool thing. And the whole book is that. It's stories of these, broadly forgotten people in Texas history, but written from their relatives, from a perspective that not anyone could write. There's a certain element of that in there. And so it's not the longest book in the world. It's not the most comprehensive thing. There's tons and tons of people. That's the nature of history. You can't possibly learn every detail about it, but it's very compelling and it's very cool. And I'm happy to be, kind of in that tradition, right? So even though we don't live in Texas anymore, the kind of ideas that went into what Texas maybe was, I still very much resonate with those things, even though maybe modern Texas doesn't necessarily reflect those things anymore. And that's a whole conversation, that's
The whole other conversation, absolutely. But what was really interesting there is you said something really important, which was, the ideals and the pieces there still resonate with you. And you are a product of that history too, right? This is where the whole divine synchronicity piece comes in, is that, when we really think about it, what are the chances that two people in a huge world filled with people would meet in order to create children that eventually led to you, right?
I love thinking about that. Yeah, that's a wonderful. I try to post that on social media and stuff. Think about how many generations of people had to survive for you to exist. Because most people in history died before they.
Most people a lot of people in history died. It's true, yes. But if we think of it from that connection piece, and that's really where my whole book is about connection, about relationship to community and to self, right? That can become very self-centered very quickly with, look how many people created me and me. But we think of it this way. Think about how many, thousands of people are walking around the planet right now who are going to share one of your great-great-grandchildren or great-great-great-great-grandchildren. And you don't know any of these people, but all of their stories are going to merge into somebody who's going to come from you and all of them.
Right. Yeah, it boggles the mind, right? And so there's definitely an element of, I feel like human beings tend to think that they decide everything. And really the majority of what shapes your decisions are, things that have been incorporated into you, but that you don't actively think about, right? You don't go, okay, what is every level of profundity that I could contemplate before you decide what to eat for lunch, right? You just don't do that. You eat that because that's what you used to eat as a child or whatever, right? And it's that family history and genealogy and some of these other things, that kind of goes into that in an unspoken way, and that you will never contemplate unless you shine a spotlight on it and all of that. So it's cool that you're shining a spotlight on it.
Well, I thank you. And it's like, I feel like people get it, but they need to point it out. And in many different ways. There are many different ways to say this. But what I love is the idea of, it's an unfolding as opposed to a fatalistic, it was always going to happen, right? And this, I have a tattoo here, people can see it. So this is the bind rune. It's a Nordic symbol. It's a new symbol. It was only created a few years ago, but it's based on older understandings. And the Scandinavian understanding, and by virtue Irish, because I know Irish is a big thing for you too. The understanding of the North Sea when it comes to fate, very different from Greco-Roman and Christian, which is that there is a central deity that is always there, figuring everything out for everybody. In the Nordic understanding, fate is more like a tapestry that's constantly being woven in every single moment. And where the whole like Viking sense of valor and heroism came in was how you as an individual faced whatever was coming at you. Because whether or not, like, you couldn't control what was coming at you, but how you faced it impacted what happened next. And so it's that cause and effect piece, right? Sometimes we have to deal with things where, there's a stream of something going on that just veers into our lane. We have to deal with that. Now, if we were to say, oh, well, it was bound to happen, it was fated, and just accept whatever, that would be seen as an unheroic thing in the Viking and Icelandic context. And I really, really like that because it's a call to action. It's a call to you determining how you're going to interact with whatever is happening. And in that process, then, the tapestry is woven in a different way than if you were to just put up your hands and say, no, I'm not going to have any action here, right?
It's interesting, I'm having this thought that there's different, the right word is escaping me, different, say, brands of what individualism actually means, like a different context of what individualism is, because there's a particular, it's like an idea like God or something. Everyone thinks that they understand what that means, but nobody understands. No. You don't understand that term in the same way that the next person does. And so individualism, I feel like kind of has that context as well. Like in Japan, there's a different understanding of what an individualist is versus in America, or even different states in America, or different, provinces in Canada, perhaps, right? So, or within different towns, there's different contexts. There's a town in Texas called Gonzales. If you've ever seen that white and black flag with the cannon on it, says "Come and take it." That's where that's from. They have a "Come and Take It" festival every year, and it's a whole thing. But that's a context that's more or less unique to people who go there for that festival and who live there. and so it's not something that's generally embraced. I've got another question. So a quick pivot. So have you read the book "The Body Keeps the Score" by Bessel van der Kolk? Okay. So I just butchered his name. Bessel van der Kolk.
Van der Kolk. Yes.
That I'm just curious, and this has nothing to do with really the context of the show. Maybe only obliquely, but if you look at something, say, like obesity. I'm just trying to pick an example here. I think there's a popular understanding, at least within certain aspects of the medical community, like, oh, that's, it's got a genetic component, like you can inherit this like obesity thing, whatever it is, gene or whatever. But I would say that it's more the social context of your genetics, right? It's we eat this way. And so of course you're going to raise your child to eat the same way that you eat, unless you make a drastic change, which is unlikely. And so I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on something like that, where it's, where do you draw the line? Is that still hereditary or is that, not really?
Well, it's both. That's the thing. It's both. There is an emerging field of genetics which show how certain traumas in life and how certain environmental factors will affect genetics. I can't think what the term is. I want to say ergonomics, but no, that's something totally different.
That's okay. That's
It's very early morning.
That's all right,
but this form of genetics talks about how certain genetic markers are activated through external pressures and traumas. The biggest one is the Holocaust, for example, right? That process of starvation during the Holocaust for survivors has activated certain genetic markers that is now shown up as diabetes in certain aspects of the Jewish community, right? And we see this in the African American community. We see this in a lot of communities. I think this is going to become a big thing. But we also have to look at it from a social standpoint too, right? You grow up in a situation where those become the family norm. That becomes the family culture, right? The South, right, is butter, 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 right? Everything is butter, right?
I love butter.
I love butter too. But when you look at kind of what the lifestyle of those recipes come from, people were working harder in the fields, or they were having to walk. They didn't have the convenience of a car, so they were more physical, and so that butter helped produce energy. I think the type of food back then was also very different. Nowadays, you walk into a grocery store, and any of the Jim Bro bunnies who are listening to this are going to know this, right? You walk into a store and you look at most of the food items, and every single one of them, except some things, have, at least in North America, high fructose corn syrup, right? So when you look at environmental factors in that, those are societal things that have contributed to the obesity epidemic in North America and the Western world, I would say. And it's entirely because of factors that are both outside and also inside our control. But if you're operating from a narrative, a lot of my work with my therapy clients are around narratives and subconscious narratives. If you're operating from a view that, well, this is normal, this type of food is normal, right? You're going to have to do a lot of deprogramming to think of things in different ways, right? And I'm sure, you see this with your own clients, I'm sure. And we talked about this the other day, the whole deprogramming from those financial, cultural points of view that are going to impact their decisions when it comes to finances. It's the same way in therapy, right?
Right. I like to throw this out there, I'm very skeptical whenever the government is trying to solve a problem. Okay. that the solution will have the intended effect, or even that the effect is intended at all. And, that's a whole conversation. I won't derail everything, but it's funny because people will say, oh, okay, well, we don't trust the government on this. We don't trust the government on that. And, this is obviously wrong. There's lots of data there to prove this is wrong, et cetera, et cetera. But in this one aspect, everybody just kind of goes, oh, okay, great. Tax qualified retirement plans that are sponsored by your employer and automatically deducted out of your paycheck. Those are the best thing in the world. And you got to make sure you do that. And it's like, but why? The government made that. So why do you trust them in this one particular area if you distrust them in every other area? It just doesn't seem very consistent to me. And, kind of unpacking that. I make that point sometimes on podcasts when I'm a guest and things like that. But in my book, I don't make that point. I just kind of analyze it piece by piece. It's like, okay, here's an assumption. Is that true or not? And kind of walk through it. So don't get me started on my book, man. I'll talk about that all day. I know.
Well, it ties back into what we were talking about before. That moment of change for me was that moment of, okay, I'm getting a body sensation, and Body Keeps the Score is a great example of that. The body is telling me, my rational head, where the narratives are, that something is wrong, something is different, something needs to change, or something big is about to happen, and I need to prepare up here. Because we often this is what gets in our way often, right? We can only be rational to a certain point. Before we start to actually need to have that experience piece, right? So the merging of the heart and the head, bringing in Iron John, right? The whole mythopoetic movement, right? It's all connected. It's the bringing together of those aspects. Now, Western society tells men particularly, you have to stay up here. This is where your strong point is. Well, I know a lot of male people, and this is not their strong point, but they have good hearts. And that's where their success lies, because they have the hunch, they have the knack for business in a business sense. They may not know all of the details, but then they can hire other people to do that for them, right? But their flow is here, and that's what makes them successful, right? Other people, it's up here. This is what's going to make them. So it's bringing those, it's individualism within a framed context of community. I think that's a really important piece.
I like the way you said that.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing with the, say, divine masculine, divine feminine, getting and all that, that's a whole, another episode, that would be a lot of fun. I'm trying to be conscious of the time because I know how much of a talker I am, but if you would, let's shift into, just make sure we cover all of our bases, right? So let's shift into, if you weren't doing this, if you hadn't written your book, if you hadn't, done all these other things because you're 2015 September, I believe you said.
Yes.
That moment, if that hadn't happened, if you decided, I'm not going to go to that show after all, and so the opportunity passed you by, do you think that this is, like you said before, like a foregone thing? Like maybe it would have come back up and maybe this would have delayed, or do you think that your life would be in a completely different place?
I don't know if I can trust that the person I would be now would be as mature or experienced as I am now. I mean, and I'll be flat out honest with you. In 2015, I felt like I was a child still, living at home. I didn't really have a lot of, I was a very naive individual in many ways. And I was a very angry, bitterly angry individual, and I couldn't quite understand why. There's a lot of unpacking that needed to happen. And I don't know if I would necessarily have had the kick in my ass to actually go and do that thing. But I think I would have done I would have been I would have been in a different place. I would have been somewhere, right? I don't know if I would have all of these pieces. All of these pieces have really come because they've been things I've wanted to do, but I've never been in the right position to actually sit down and do them. Right? I'll give you an example, right? Over the past 3.5 months, I've been writing a 180,000 page book, my second, right? And that's entirely because out of a product of having gone through an 8-month experience a few years ago to write my first, right? I have the skills, I have the technique, I have the connections, I have the support structure from other authors who are, bigger names than me. My name's a little tiny thing, but it's, like a friend of mine whose book has sold 200,000 copies, and I have that connection, I wouldn't have had that if I didn't write my book, which would have all of these things lined up. So I would have been somewhere. I'm not sure where. It's like I asked myself that question of if I had never moved from the UK and I had, who would I be now? I would be a lot more narrow focused, I think. Having gone through that experience of that culture shock and also having that multicultural experience has been huge. So I don't know if I would be as curious about life and the world if I hadn't gone through that. Same in 2015.
Sure. Well, so why don't you tell me kind of where people can learn more about your work and what's your current, I guess, array of things that you'd like to send people to and have them check out. Of course, we'll have links to that in the description, and all that. But, just verbally kind of walk us through what's the right fit for everyone and how they can learn more.
Of course. So because I have kind of fingers in multiple pies, for benstimpson.com is really the place where everything is. I teach classes, particularly around folklore and history and kind of witchcraft stuff. It's kind of my more focus on the humanities. I have Patreon where there is a class archive on there. I've been teaching classes for the past few years online, so there's a lot of material on there. For my therapy stuff, I have my website as well, benstimpson.com. I can work with people in North America. Most of my focus is on the UK now. But if anything here has jived, spiritual direction is very similar. It really goes into that kind of mytho-poetic connection point with divine, with whoever you have, or whatever you happen to conceptualize that with. It comes about to relationship. My podcast is really connected to my book. And that was a really big piece around promoting my book and promoting my work, was connecting with other authors in that niche. So if anybody's interested in kind of a metaphysical community or the witchcraft or Wicca community, most of my guests have been authors on that. And that's available on YouTube, Spotify, and all that. So everything's on benstimpson.com. And I also have a Facebook page and social media pages, Instagram, and all that. So
cool. Well, we'll link it all below, and hope some people will decide to check those things out and support what you're doing. I definitely need to check out your book, it sounds like, after our conversation. And so, that's all very exciting. Any last final words as we wrap things up here? Is there any, unresolved little thread in our conversation?
I think we covered everything, Luke. Honestly, this has been a lovely, lovely chat, and I've really enjoyed it. I will say that because I know a lot of your listeners are connected with the finances stuff and the financial piece, I will say that look back into your family history. Look back at those moments and those stories, because undoubtedly, I mean, I certainly found a lot of inspiration knowing that successive generations of my family have built from nothing each time. One of the big pieces of my family has been that things have not been handed down. It's always been the onus to build our own stuff. And that's allowed us, many of my family, to go and pursue our own passions and pieces like that. Look back in your family line to find those individuals, those ancestors who you can look up to as heroes, as legends, as people to gain inspiration from, and know that the same blood that's in them is flowing in you. I think that's a big piece there.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you said that. So, Ben, thanks so much for all your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Blast having you on the show. We're just right shy of the 1 hour mark, so I think we timed it perfectly. And I'm going to close it down, but I will see everyone on the next episode. And again, check the description box below to see the links to all of Ben's fine work. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for listening to The Price of Time, hosted by Luke Tatum. Subscribe to us for more episodes. Check the description box below to learn more about our guest. And if you found this episode valuable, please share it with a friend.